International Economics at the University of Würzburg, and I'm deeply honored to chair this first panel session today. We have three very exciting speakers, extremely knowledgeable on Ricardian economics, on trade theory. I'm not going to take much of your time. We have Doug Irwin from Dartmouth College, we have Daniel Bernhofen, and we have Switgard Feuerstein, who will, in this order, present their remarks, their ideas on Ricardo's heritage. And I look very much forward to your exciting talks. Douglas, it's your start, and I will mainly check that you remain within the time limit.
Sounds good. I'm going to go over here.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It's really a delight to be here, and I want to congratulate the organizers for their foresight in planning ahead for the 200th anniversary of the publication of Ricardo's Principles on Political Economy, and of course the great chapter that has comparative advantage in it. What I want to do is provide some historical context to the era in which Ricardo was writing, why he came up with this theory perhaps, and some of its immediate impact. And so a lot of this is covered in a book I wrote 20 years ago, Against the Tide in Intellectual History of Free Trade, so if you're interested, you could read more about it there. But as you know, in 1776, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. International trade was a large part of that work. What's interesting is that it did not stimulate a lot of extra work on international trade or on economics in general. Not that it fell dead-born from the press like some of David Hume's work had, but it just didn't stimulate a lot of follow-up work. What really triggered a lot of work on international trade was the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s. And of course, you know, during that period, there was the Continental Blockade, massive disruption of global commerce as Britain and France were fighting, not just here in Europe, but around the world. And a tract was written in 1807 by William Spence called Britain Independent of Commerce. It may have been an early harbinger of Brexit, because what Spence said is that actually Britain doesn't need all this foreign commerce stuff. The fact that commerce has been disrupted by wars isn't such a bad thing, that after the war, Britain didn't need to open up to the world economy. It could survive quite well on its own because its wealth depended on its own land and things of that sort. That tract triggered a huge outpouring of work defending the proposition that international trade was a source of wealth for countries, and that's when James Mill, Robert Torrens, and a bunch of others pushed back against that idea and said that commerce is a source of wealth. And that really gave rise to, along with the work that was being done on monetary economics during this period, because once again, the wars led to great disruption in terms of the monetary system. Britain had gone off the gold standard, questions about what to do after the war. That really, all this upheaval in terms of the economics of the day led to this group called the classical economists, who were very much interested in dealing with the economic issues of the day. And foremost among those classical economists was David Ricardo. So David Ricardo was a stockbroker in London, and in 1797 he took a vacation in Bath, in the west of England. You might have been there. It's a nice place to take a vacation. And on the shelf of the hotel or the bed and breakfast that he was staying, they had a copy of The Wealth of Nations, which of course he'd heard about, but never really picked up. Now he had time on vacation to read it. He read it and became absorbed. And perhaps to the horror of his wife, he said, I'm going to quit my job and become an economist. Now, actually, that wasn't such a bad thing because he was a very wealthy person. He'd done quite well in the stock market. And he started writing about economic matters, and he befriended James Mill, who pushed him to put his ideas down on paper. And it was really James Mill that really pushed for the publication, for the completion of this book on the principles of political economy and taxation, which he was eventually published on that date just a few weeks ago when his work was published, including the idea of comparative advantage. Roy Ruffin has gone over Ricardo's correspondence with Mill and with others as he was writing the book. He wrote it sort of sequentially, linearly, and we can identify the fact that he was working on this chapter on foreign trade in the first 2 weeks of October of 1816. Now, the publication lags weren't so bad back then because if you finish the book in October, November, it's published in April, that's not bad. But he came up with the idea, we think, of the idea of comparative advantage during this period here. And of course, it was a great achievement. And what he said, of course, is that, here are my props, England will produce the cloth, the wine will be produced in Portugal, and they can both benefit from trade, even though England or Portugal might have an advantage in producing one or the other. Now, this, of course, is cloth. You don't have to, not too much to say about that. This is my favorite wine bottle because what does it say on the label? laissez-faire. And actually, I think there could be a problem here because laissez-faire may be a good economic policy in some realms, but it's not a good way of making wine. So the vintners here actually say, we just let our grapes grow and then we sort of harvest it and we sort of let it be. And it turns out, I was very excited to see this bottle, but it's actually terrible wine. So laissez-faire does not work to produce great wine. And in fact, I think this is a violation of the theory of comparative advantage because this wine comes from the state of Maine. And I don't know if you know where Maine is in the United States. This is not ideal growing place for wine. And so I was all set to buy a case of this, but I took one sip of it and said, I'm not even going to finish the bottle, but I'll keep the bottle because it's worthwhile. So now, Gene Grossman, the great trade economist, says it's not cloth for wine anymore, and that's true to some extent. Now we worry about intermediate goods, we worry about outsourcing of various parts of the production process, but there still is a lot of cloth for wine trade going on. Now, when we look at the paragraphs in which Ricardo talks about comparative advantage in this chapter, the whole chapter is not dominated by the idea of comparative advantage, it's just a few sections. And they're not the easiest sections to understand. It's a very complicated numerical example. One can understand why lay people don't exactly get the theory on the first reading. In fact, the great economist from the University of Chicago, George Stigler, once said, after reading Ricardo's chapter, what a lay person will embrace is not the English theory of free trade, but a bottle of Portuguese wine, because you need to drown your sorrows of trying to figure out what he's trying to say. In addition, Ricardo, he did use the term comparative advantage, but it wasn't the highlight of the chapter and wasn't the highlight of the book, and he didn't really follow up. It sort of seemed like not quite off-the-cuff remarks within this chapter, and there was very little follow-up by Ricardo in terms of the theory. And what happened was his friends James Mill and James Mill's son, John Stuart Mill, really recognized that this was an important insight, and they really pushed it. So James Mill said, this is a great insight, you should be saying more about it. John Stuart Mill, in some essays written as a very young man in 1829, but not published until 1844, his essays on some unsettled questions of political economy, and there on the right-hand side have just underlined this idea that differences in the absolute cost of production, which determined the interchange, but differences in the comparative costs. It was really John Stuart Mill, both here and in his Principles of Political Economy, that gives Ricardo the credit and really pushes the idea that this is something new. Now, with many discoveries in economics, there's something in the air. Usually there aren't these just breakthroughs that happen out of ether. So for example, the formal proof of general equilibrium, a number of people, Arrow, DeBrew, Mackenzie, were working on this sort of simultaneously. And the same thing might be true a little bit with comparative advantage. So one can even go back to Adam Smith. And here's a passage very early in Adam Smith, when he talks about the most opulent nations generally excel all their neighbors in agriculture as well as in manufactures, but they're commonly more distinguished by their superiority in the latter than the former. In the poor country, notwithstanding the inferiority of its cultivation, can in some measure rival the rich country in its cheapness and goodness of corn. It can pretend no such competition with it in manufactures, at least if those manufactures suit the soil, climate, and situation of the rich country. There's the idea of relative advantage, but he just doesn't push it through to a theory of trade that sort of really identifies comparative advantage as the basis of international trade. But this notion was very much out there. What Ricardo did was pin it down, formalize it, model it, give it a logical structure that really is, we still talk about today, obviously. Now, we still have to pay homage to Smith because Ricardo was reacting to Smith in writing the Principles of Political Economy, and that's why I wore my Adam Smith tie today, which apparently you can no longer get because the factory that makes these went out of business, and Adam Smith would have no other way. If there's no demand for the product, there's no reason to be pushing it. But unfortunately, we don't have any David Ricardo ties, and I look forward someday to buying one of those. Now, in this, continue with this idea that comparative advantage was sort of in the air, there is what I'd call an authorship kerfuffle. It's not a controversy, but it's a kerfuffle because a lot of other people have at some point either staked claim in this idea of comparative advantage. James Mill, who was pushing Ricardo all the time, and actually had, some people say, a clear example in his Elements of Political Economy. Robert Torrens also had this idea of relative advantage, but really didn't push it through either. This doesn't rise to the intensity of the Shakespearean authorship controversy, but there has been a number of papers written about this. But I think it's fairly well established now, economic historians going over the record, that Ricardo should get the credit and does deserve the credit for coming up with this idea. Now the question is, did Ricardo use it? Did he use this idea of comparative advantage to make the case for freer trade? And what's sort of interesting is that he didn't. He really didn't use the idea very much in talking about foreign trade and advocating for trade at the time. Now the big issue in Britain at this time, of course, was what is Britain's post-war trade policy going to be after Napoleon is defeated? And the big issue there was the Corn Laws, restrictions on importation of foreign wheat and agricultural products, which were very high in Britain during this period. Ricardo didn't use comparative advantage at all in arguing that the Corn Laws ought to be removed and trade ought to be opened up. On the left-hand side, there's a copy of the pamphlet which he wrote in 1815 before the Principles, called An Essay on the Influence of a Low Price of Corn Upon the Profits of Stock. That's the one where he took aim at the Corn Laws. And then in 1822, he wrote another pamphlet called Protection to Agriculture, where he also took aim at the idea that Britain should be protecting agricultural producers. Here's where Ricardo comes up with yet another theory, or another framework, I should say, that for which we should tip our hats to him. He came up with basically a rough structure of what we now know as the specific factors model. Paul Samuelson called it the Ricardo-Wiener model. I really think it should be called the Habeler model, because Gottfried Habeler really pinned it down much more in detail. But here's the basic structure. What Ricardo pointed out was not just cloth for wine, with labor being the only factor of production. He said, really, there are three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. And we can think about land being used in the production of food, capital being the production of manufactured goods, labor being a mobile factor. Land, of course, would earn rent. Capital owners would earn profits. And we can think about income distribution in this framework. Now, what would free trade in corn do to income distribution in Britain during this period? Well, it would lower the price of corn, which would lower the value of land, which would lower the rent on land. So it would redistribute income away from landlords and shift it towards capital owners, and then manufacturing would become the expanding sector. The profits of capital would go up. That would be good for Britain, because you cannot augment land, but you can augment capital. And if you raise the profit rate, you'll increase the incentives for capital accumulation, and you'll make Britain a more prosperous country by expanding its capital base. Who's missing? Labor. Ricardo, along with other classical economists of the day, basically had a subsistence theory of wages, that the wage rate paid to labor is tied to its principal consumption good, which was corn. So if you reduce the price of corn, what that will do is reduce nominal wages in the economy, and that will allow the expansion of manufacturing. So you get this income redistribution in Britain that Ricardo and others pointed to, but it's not one that's really going to favor workers. It's just going to shift income from landowners to capital owners. Well, this is sort of a different way of thinking about trade, and one that I'll come back to in just a moment, because it turned out not to be a very politically popular way of thinking about trade during this period. Now, one might think that basically all economists were in favor of freer trade during this period. That was not the case. There was a clash of two titans in this era. David Ricardo against the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who is known for the principle of population, but also wrote Principles of Political Economy before Ricardo had. They took differing views on whether Britain should be open to commerce. Thomas Malthus was, in some sense, the Peter Navarro of his day. I don't know if you know who Peter Navarro is, but he's one of President Trump's advisors on trade, who takes a rather dim view of trade in many ways. Peter Navarro gave a speech recently in which he spoke about this antiquated Ricardian theory of trade that most academic economists still cling to. Of course, we're here today and we do cling to it because it's so insightful. But what was Malthus saying that's actually being repeated by Peter Navarro to some extent? Two points. One, Malthus said Britain should not repeal the Corn Laws and open up to trade because there's a national security risk. If you're going to be exposed to imports of corn, you're going to be dependent on foreign suppliers, and for national security reasons, we don't want that dependence. We need our own domestic sources of supply. The second point Malthus made is that if you repeal the corn laws, you're going to force the economy to go through a wrenching domestic adjustment. That means it's going to be very painful as the price of corn falls to landlords, to the farmers who are working on the land and the laborers, as you take resources from them and push it into other sectors of the economy. Malthus said the adjustment will be slow, painful, and unfavorable to happiness, and therefore Britain should not repeal the corn laws. Now, actually, this diminished to some extent Malthus's reputation among other economists of the day, because he was going very much against the grain, and Malthus later on began to back off of that strong statement. But here's sort of the problem for the politicians of the day. If you look to economics as a source for inspiration about where policy should go in terms of trade, first of all, you have Ricardo saying we should do it, but it's not going to help out workers. It's going to help out capital owners. And Malthus saying we shouldn't do it at all because we really need to preserve the position of the aristocracy. First of all, you see economists disagreeing. Second of all, you see the two major economists of the day seemingly acting on the basis of class interests. Ricardo championing capital owners, Malthus championing landowners. Usually we think that politicians represent classes and we economists represent the general interest or the public interest. Well, unfortunately, those roles were reversed at this time. There was, however, one politician who rose above class interests and thought about the general interest. And that was Sir Robert Peel, who was ultimately responsible for introducing in Parliament the legislation repealing the Corn Laws in 1846. Where was Peel's views on this formed? He did look to political economy, but he saw exactly those things, that political economy is not providing a way in which I can really effectively argue in favor of free and open trade. Peel embraced the idea of freer trade despite the views of economists of the day, not because of the views of the economists of the day. In particular, his thought hinged on this idea of what will happen to workers' wages if we repeal the Corn Laws. Political economists said it's not going to really have a big impact. But these two quotes from Peel show that what he wanted was something that would increase the standards of living of the workers of the day. And he went through some early tariff reductions in the early 1840s where he saw that when the tariffs came down, wages did not fall, real wages went up. So the first quote there, my confidence in the validity of the reasons on which I myself heretofore relied on for the maintenance of restrictions on the import of corn, in other words, justified the maintenance of the Corn Laws, has been materially weakened by the many concurring proofs that the wages of labor do not vary with the price of corn. And then the second quote there is just saying that if you listen to the political economists, they'll say the ultimate tendency of wages is to accommodate itself to the price of food. I must say that I do not believe it. His was an empirical case, an empirical observation he was making, that if we cut the price of imported foods, that real wages would go up. So I don't want to end on a sad note saying that Ricardo had no influence on policy because of that, because obviously he has a big impact on the way economists think about trade in many, many different ways, not just comparative advantage, but the specific factors model and so many other ways. If I could correct the story about Paul Samuelson, it was actually a mathematician, Stanislaw Ulam, a very distinguished mathematician who challenged Paul Samuelson to name one proposition in the social sciences that was both true and non-trivial. And he actually stumped Samuelson, who didn't think about it on the spot, but later on said, I should have come up with a theory of comparative advantage because that fits the bill. And so I'm so glad that we are here to celebrate 200 years after the publication of the principles, Ricardo's great achievement. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Douglas, for your illuminating talk. And we now move on with Daniel Bernhofen.
So first of all, thank you for the organizers for hosting this event and for Gabriel Felbermayr. So I'm going to talk about Ricardo's comparative logic at the time. So I'm going a little bit into the analytics of that. So the statement of comparative advantage is in a section, a passage in his 1817 chapter 7 book. And so what is the outline? I want to talk first about David Ricardo's what I call puzzling formulation of comparative advantage. because how it has been traditionally interpreted for 185 years. And there's been a bit of a debate here, since trade economists followed actually what turned out to be, like Douglas mentioned, that the Mills, John Stuart Mill actually provided the formal work of the Ricardo model. We think about that. And Ricardo, in his writing, he was not a very good writer. I think so in his setup, it was quite of an ambiguity what he really meant by those numbers that he provided on that. And for 185 years, there's been the trade economists followed the John Stuart Mill interpretation of this fantastic framework that we built on that and getting stronger and stronger, versus the economic historians were having this debate that what he was saying really doesn't make too much sense. If you look at his passage, so I think the conclusions are not based on his underlying assumption. He's unclear about that. And so there's been a puzzle. Should he really should he be given credit to that? And then in 2002, Roy Ruffin really wrote a very interesting article, and we discovered an older interpretation of Ricardo by Piero Sraffa. Give you a background, historical background. Sraffa was a Cambridge economist that John Maynard Keynes put into the library because he wasn't a good teacher. And so he wanted to take it away from students, but he looked at all the correspondences that Ricardo did. And if someone knew about Ricardo's writing, I think it was Sraffa. And Sraffa interpreted the numbers a bit differently. And I think the logic at this time was quite fascinating because it is much more general that we really think about how the logic is formulated. So this conference is here on a British achievement on German ground. So I thought I'll go a little bit further about the work that other people have done on comparative advantage. And Gottfried Habler was also mentioned. Gottfried Habler, he's not German, but he's Austrian. Gabriel Felbermayr and Willi Kohler are Austrians too. And Gottfried Habler really freed this notion of comparative advantage that was antiquated. And Peter Navarro stole here from John Maynard Keynes. This antiquated theory of comparative advantage is based on the labor theory of value. And this is also an antiquated framework, and he freed it and provide us the way we think we teach our students now, called the opportunity cost formulation of comparative advantage. And this really provided a big breakthrough in our thinking on that and helped us to move further on that. And so then I will talk a little bit at the end. Doug talked about the two goods, cloth and wine. So people considering this, we tell our textbook, does it really tell us about the real world with thousands of goods, with multiple factors? It turns out to be that the underlying Ricardian logic can be really curved over to an arbitrary number of goods and factors. It can be actually tested empirically and can be actually refuted that it's not holding. Okay, so it is really a scientific achievement at the time. So let's go first about Ricardo's four magical numbers, go a little bit in the text. So when we have a celebration of Leonardo da Vinci, we look at his paintings. So we have a celebration of comparative advantage, look at the passage on there. So he talked about that without going too much into details about two countries. He talked about Portugal and England, and he talked about two commodities, wine and cloth. And he talked about the trading relationship. He always talked about trade the quantity of wine which she, Portugal, shall give in exchange for cloth in England. And then he thought they are not so much determined by the quantities devoted as if they were manufactured in their own economy. So the first sentence says so much, something will happen, international trade is different than domestic trade on that. Then the second paragraph talks about two numbers, and they are called four magical numbers because they we consider being the genesis of trade theory. And so England, when he says that it costs maybe so circumstance to produce a cloth may require the labor of 100 men for 1 year. If she attempted to make the wine 120 men, and based on those two numbers, he makes a conclusion. Okay? So England would find it of interest to import wine to purchase for exportation of cloth. This seems self-contained logical statement. Based on those numbers, you have a conclusion. But then he talks about Portugal. And he comes also up with two numbers. And so Portugal also needs 80 men for 1 year to produce cloth and 90 80 for wine and 90 for cloth. And also comes with a conclusion it was advantageous for them to exchange for them. He was not very explicit here what those numbers really meant directly. And so Ricardo's framework, if we put it together, and Peter Neal will talk about what is a model, it has three elements that any model had to think about systematically. It has assumptions. We assume two countries and two goods. It has a logic. The question is, what kind of logic did he use? And the logic is about those four numbers, and then he makes a prediction. Okay, that's how we economists think about that. Prediction that both England and Portugal will gain, and then England will export cloth and import wine. So the puzzling notion about what is the logic between those four numbers that he involved on that. And then we go back to the Mills, I think, with James and John Stuart Mill, that really provided the analytics framework. And so the Ricardos passage seems incomplete. It doesn't mention really costs or prices at terms in which international trade takes place. And so what James Mill did a reading of Ricardos numbers as per unit labor costs. Okay? And so those numbers are the relative costs, how many labor units are necessary to produce 1 unit of cloth and wine. And it gives you the relatively production costs of cloth versus wine in England and wine. And then England exports cloth because of its low relative production cost. His son, John Stuart Mill, goes then further on. Then we had extensions for that, and Ethan Cartam, Samuel Cartam did work on how you can develop that in a very, very general framework. But the problem about that is that the Mill's interpretation makes Ricardo's paragraph is illogical, makes little sense, because you need all 4 numbers to make this conclusion. You cannot make a conclusion just on the first 2 numbers. And so what is going on? So this is the controversy about this passage. But if you interpret the logic a bit differently, and it turns out to be, if under certain circumstances they both are the same, have a similar interpretation there, then actually we get more an exciting formulation about that. And there are 3 parts in Ricardo's logic. Okay, looking about at this time what historians, Rafa and the historians of economic thought who look carefully about the passage looked at that. First, Ricardo had an understanding that international trade is beneficial. So this is one key part of what he thought about what we consider gains from international trade. So this was quite intuitive for me. Then he needed a theory of value. Okay. We talk about, he developed a labor theory of value, and he probably did this in 1816, in the year before he did the formulation. And then the third part of that is the recognition that international trade is governed by different rules than domestic trade is involved on that. First, the perennial question, is international trade beneficial? And so how did Ricardo think at the time? So Ricardo was not the first time who thought about trade. So this was called the 18th century rule, what Jacob Weiner expressed in 1937. People before Ricardo, actually, and this is the Henry Martins in 1701, talked about the way the English thought about, is the trade with East India beneficial? And they come up with the criteria that the East Indian trade in the 18th century, there are a lot of competing products. The English manufacturing had to compete with the merging manufacturing in East India. So it pays, trade will be beneficial as a criteria if it pays to import commodities from abroad at an exchange for export at a smaller cost than it would production at home would entail. So implicit in the discussion is that you could produce importly domestically, what you import also domestically, but it's a higher cost. Okay, and so Adam Smith employed it also in his inquiry in the nature and cost of the wealth of nations, and Ricardo also made careful use of that in terms of this 19th century rule of the gains from trade, comparing imports versus exports in terms of how costly they are. So how do we look about the second part is a wide theory of value. And now we go back here to George Stigler. In economics, the most fundamental of these problems is the theory of value. Okay? The theory of value must explain question, what do we produce, how many quantities, and how will the resources be employed? And without a theory of value, the economists have no theory of international trade. So it was the genesis that we're celebrating here at this conference, the theory of international trade. It has a theory of value. In this sense, David Ricardo was very, very different than Adam Smith. He developed his theory of value just in 1816. He did it in different ways there. And here's his labor theory of value. And then, next one here. It doesn't seem to work here. Okay. So then the third criteria is there, that how does international trade differ from domestic trade? If you thought about commodities are valued in terms of labor unit, he made a famous statement: the labor of 100 Englishmen cannot be given for that of 80 Englishmen. Just 100 Englishmen can be given for 100 Englishmen, but the labor of 100 Englishmen can be given for the labor of the Portuguese or for the labor of 80 Portuguese. So that international exchange is different than domestic exchange. Now, can we look at that in the graph? So this is, I'm pushing you a little bit in terms of a graphical framework. We think about trade within England, okay, between Manchester and Brighton. Okay, so he looked about the number of Englishmen in cloth production. So you put 100 workers into cloth production, so you tie 100 workers in cloth production. If you want to put more into wine production, so you just can't put the 100 work in wine production. And the exchange is 100 Englishmen are exchanged for 100 Englishmen. Okay, this is the exchange on that. So these are the rules governing domestic exchange. And now this is important because we would see about the domestic exchange is our criteria. In what way international trade is beneficial and also differs itself from domestic trade. So what Ricardo did, he applied his labor theory value to evaluate international exchange. So look, the quantity of wine which she, Portugal, should give in exchange for the cloth of England. And so implicitly, Ricardo assumed that some units of cloth are exchanged in some units of wine. He didn't say what those numbers are. Okay. If there are one gets one, this labor interpretation that the traditional but labor embodied, and this interpretation is the same. They are one-to-one. So, but he made now, England may be so circumstanced that 100 men, the production of cloth may require the labor of 100 men, and the cloth is the cloth exchanged would call 100 men. If the wine that she imported would cost 120 men, England would get a benefit because they give up 100 workers and you get counterfactually 120 workers for producing this wine. And this, you just need those two numbers then in order to get that you, first of all, it's good for the country to do that. And it gives you something about the gains from trade. If these 20 Englishmen are going to be saved. He doesn't relate it to anything else, what the 20 Englishmen compared to the number of Englishmen over there. But this can we do then later on there. So the rules governing international exchange, we think about also using the same diagram, but think about the number of Englishmen in cloth exports. You give up 100 workers. So we think about exports as a cost that we give. And then you ask ourselves, if you would import the wine, it would be 120 units of workers would be necessary for the wine to do it also in England. But now he picked this combination that Englishmen cloth export are transferred, cloth is exported and wine is imported. But we could also have alternatively. So what will happen if Englishmen, if we have cloth imported, and if we have here 100, we will gain 100 workers. But if we were exporting wine, it cost us 120 workers. Now, so those two numbers now, where does this gains from trade criteria comes in now? So if you think about that, the domestic exchange is a reference point. Okay? So among the two possibilities that you had, should you export cloth for wine or import? So in this scenario, you get workers, you get a gain of 20 workers. Okay. If you really do it in the wrong direction, you get 20 workers that you lose if you were exporting wine and importing cloth. So the interesting thing about this I mentioned then, think about we consider in modern terms in front of the gains from trade is a criteria for the pattern of trade. Now at the end of the day, so who's deciding that? Okay. Ricardo had this notion of Adam Smith, the invisible hand. So we needed a long time of 100, 150 years in the 20th century recognized these competitive markets. So markets really make the decision. Okay, and markets allocate resources either in the one direction in favor of comparative advantage or against comparative advantage. And so that's why understanding and tests for comparative advantage automatically in some ways tests for the working of the invisible hand because we could go in the different direction here. Okay. So now Ricardo applies the same logic to Portugal. And the interesting thing is, so we can go here very quickly. So you can have the same criteria for Portugal, those two numbers, and independently, you can actually then find that Portugal would have a gain if they export wine, okay? And if they import wine, they would have a loss. And now the fascinating thing about that is this underlying logic applies to the number of goods and to number of economies. So it applies to England and to Portugal over there, and you don't have the straitjacket that it really holds only in two economies that trade economists have really wrestled with that. So let's project a little bit more into the future here. So why is the theory of comparative advantage there? Why is it not like Peter Navarro quotes Keynes without giving reference, this antiquated theory of comparative advantage that the Washington Post's quote the administration? It's a 1820s phenomenon. It's really not out there. And our textbooks sometimes, our undergraduates, sometimes don't tell us what Ricardo said and what really the frontier knowledge is telling us. I'll give you a little bit of taste here of what in my last 10 minutes that I have here. So what has happened really after 1817? The Ricardo model became the dominant trade model until the 1930s. Okay? And so the main contribution were the mills. involved in that. And Ricardo labor theory was the foundation also for Marxian philosophy, Marxian economics. That Marx's notion of exploitation was based in his labor theory. But then in the mid-19th century, when the industrialization kicked in, we had the emergence more of a consumption society. So people considering what determines really value. Okay, it's really utility. Okay, that is really important concept of the value. A notion that the value is determined just on the production side becomes really antiquated. So the zeitgeist of the 1920s was the labor theory of value has become old-fashioned since it ignores other factors of production people recognize besides labor, land, capital. So the accumulation of capital was an important role for Marx. Piketty picks it up in the 20th century. Capital didn't play such a big role in Ricardo's world of 1817s. And so I have now this quote by Keynes. I didn't recognize it this morning that Navarro used that. The free trade case must be based in the future, not on abstract principle of laissez-faire, which few now accept. So what was the problem? The problem was people considered up to 1930 that the comparative advantage was tied to his labor theory of value. Well, since the labor theory of value, the logic was antiquated, so the prediction wouldn't have a lot of sense until an Austrian came to the rescue. Okay? And this Austrian was Gottfried Haberlos. He reformulated the theory of comparative advantage, and he reconciled this notion of value, thinking the classical writers thought the value can be measured by labor, versus the utilitarians, Jevons, Menger, and Walras, that value is determined by the consumption side. And he could reconcile those two notions of that, and he thought of the value for commodities, not the labor embodied on that. The value is not the utility, it's what you have to give up to obtain it. There's Austrian opportunity cost formulation of comparative advantage. And so value is now what we think right now since 1930. It's the opportunity cost concept that allows us to integrate the production side in the economy for the consumption side. And since we are here on German-speaking ground, Gottfried Haberler, he wrote this paper in der Weltwirtschaftsarchiv, die Theorie der komparattiven Kosten, ihre Auswertung für die Begründung des Freihandels, was not translated into English until 1987. So the theory of comparative advantage was not just an Anglo-Saxon affair, and since the Anglo-Saxon countries, the free proponent of trade, free, and England and the United States is not protectionism. So we do go back to the continental roots that we have had here for free trade about that. And Haberler was really a proponent of free trade. Haberler wrote the first textbook in international trade, also in German, Tendenzielle Handel. But the zeitgeist of Germany in the 1930s was not in favor of analytical economics. So he moved then to the United States. He translated his book in 1936, The Theory of International Trade, became a classic, first textbook of that. And Haberler was the Dr. Fart of Samuelson. And Robert Baldwin, his son Richard Baldwin, is going to talk this afternoon about that. And he really trained those trade economists in the 20th centuries about that. And so what the Haberler give us now in terms of having labor involved in that, so you just have two goods. So how do you value a good? What do you have to give up of the other good? And so what we have, this production possibility frontier. So whenever you give up something, when you have increased in activity, could be a goods, could be a task in modern framework, you have to give something up. And there's no opportunity cost involved. And so it allowed us to look about in isolation, you can only consume what you produce. And what we have here, the consumption point is identified with its production point. So your endowments, so they constrain you. Okay. But then through international trade, you can actually reach now, you can specialize in the direction of comparative advantage towards this point PT, and then it allows you to international trade to expand this constraint, and you get a consumption point that's outside of that. And so this is what Haberler actually allowed us to do. Also, he didn't provide the consumption side there, but follow-up work in the 1930s and there. And his student, Paul Samuelson, made a contribution. Paul Samuelson really proved the gains from trade in 1939. And if you think about international trade, what he showed us actually, so if you have a consumer, okay, the consumer chooses a point, a representative consumer. And now the consumer has different prices on the international trade. So the consumer, he developed about that you could have a different consumption point, but you didn't choose it. And he had this concept of revealed preference. And so you can actually, the consumer is better off under international trade than free trade. Okay. The thing about this formulation of that, it requires some assumption on consumer preferences, that a weak axiom-revealed preference holds for a lot of consumers in the aggregate. And this is a bit of a heroic assumption. A lot of experimental economists, although we trade economists work with utility function, I think this is quite restrictive here. And so now how can we give Haberler back, and how we can synthesize Haberler with Ricardo? So the numbers 100 and 120. So these are the exports of cloth, labor embodied in, imports of wine. And so how can we bring them into a cloth-wine diagram here, bringing here the Ricardian about that? So we start the textbook formulation, CA and PT. And so what we can think about that now, so with Ricardo, what those 20 workers mean. Okay. So the economy is trading. Okay. And by exporting cloth, you give up 100 workers. By importing wine, so you would have needed 120 workers to import this wine, so you get a gain of 20 workers. And the gain of 20 workers, if you didn't have international trade, if someone would give England those 20 workers, they can consume as much under isolation than what international trade would be equivalent to. So you can think of an international trade being a growth equivalent to that. And so this is quite an interesting metric here that we have Ricardo's formulation here in terms of the framework. Why is it interesting? Because you look at the gains and the cost-benefit framework. Okay. So exports, what you give up, resources give up. Imports are how many resources would it be necessary to produce of that. That is one thing. So the labor value would consider it gives you all the underlying information, a sufficient statistic, we call it in technical terms, in terms of without really need to know what the underlying consumption points are. And so it doesn't need, it is much broader than we have that. And also thinks about trade costs. Why did trade occur? Okay. One of the questions we ask ourselves, when will trade actually occur? Why did trade occur in the 19th century, not in the 15th and the 16th century? So the standard textbook answer is you need differences in opportunity costs. That's why trade occurs. The historical question is a reduction in international shipping costs. Because if international shipping costs, they were reduced in the 19th century, trade occurs. And now we can think about now certain workers are necessary to ship those goods abroad. Okay? And so let's assume you need L workers to ship them. So but there's also a condition for trade to occur at all. So the shipment should be less than the gains of 20 workers. And so you can think about technological progress that causes a decline in shipping costs or rule enforcement, what Douglas North has found, actually getting rid of pirates. That's why after the Napoleonic Wars, why trade was stimulated about that. So this can actually stimulate international trade, involve that, because we can put the resource cost. And the underlying logic, Ricardo's logic holds also in higher dimensions. It can actually be tested on that. So we're not supposed to give an equation, but I give you no equation, I give you an inequality. Okay? And so what you have exports of cloth and imports of wine, you take this Ricardian diagram here, and so we can think about terms of trade line, means all the possibility you can trade. You can export cloth, import wine, and where will you trade? There are two possibilities you can trade, either export and import it. And so this applies to an arbitrary number of goods. You have to decide where do you have. So the logic here holds to n dimension. And so there's a demarcation line, the domestic exchange line. So what you can occupy is gives you a reference, okay, about which pattern of specialization should we do. And so what we have here, and this is key, so we have then a hyperplane prediction, okay, that you have certain prices in higher dimension. So the gains from trade are conditioned for pattern of trade to hold. And so this can be tested, and we've done testing that in a very broad setting. So the law of comparative advantage is not only kind of a little idea. The law of comparative can be generalized to different environments and can be tested as a refutable proposition involved in that. So I have 2 minutes about that. So Ricardo's gains allows us for labor. What you can do, we can imply also his gains from trade logic in labor and land, like two commodities. Let's say an economy has labor and land endowment. So if you export, you lose labor and land. Imports, you get some gains of labor and land. And so you have an endowment of labor and land that trade is equivalent to. And so we applied this framework actually to, and I have just 1 minute here left. So let's go further. We applied it to an environment that is close to what Ricardo operated. Ricardo operated in Portugal and Britain in a pre-industrial stage. And we have data from the 19th century for an economy, a pre-industrial economy of Japan. We can really implement those measures that Ricardo had for how many workers do you have to give to the Japanese economy? How much land do you have to give to the economy? Capital was not as important empirically, and we don't have good capital measure in order to make it equivalent to trade. And what we found, one of the interesting thing about that international trade, there are gains that you have as percentage of their endowment, but in areas where economies who are isolated have shocks, like we found here weather shocks in 1887. It allowed the economy through trade, import goods that required a lot of land. So you think in economies in droughts, and we've seen this in India with work, in Japan, where you were in isolation in the 17th and 18th century, people died on famines. By opening up and having a weather shocks, they could actually, through trade, can import land to overcome of the lack of consideration now. And my last slide here, since time is up, 10 seconds. So let me go here to the last one. So what is the conclusion? So Ricardo's comparative advantage was an amazing intellectual achievement, really, to celebrate about that. So Ricardo's logical and comparative advantage is intuitive and it's general, okay? And people have worked on that, that the insights can be generalized in more broad environment. And so he makes a growth equivalent dimension of trade also explicit in this interpretation of that. So it can be implemented empirically and will remain an evergreen, justify the case of free trade. So we are hopefully out for a bumper area where we rely on the continental Europeans here to push the case of free trade, since the Anglo-Saxon cradles of comparative advantage is swerved by protectionism. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. We now move on with comments. I look forward to your comments. Switgard Feuerstein from the University of Heidelberg.
It's difficult to add something to those interesting and sophisticated presentations on the work of Ricardo and his intellectual achievement finding the law of comparative advantage. But actually, we haven't talked about Ricardo much yet. So I start with a slide actually on his, let's say, CV. Okay, so Ricardo was born in 1772 as the third of 17 children of a Jewish family of Portuguese origin. Actually, the family had moved from Holland recently. And his father was a successful stockbroker and very wealthy. And at the age of 14, his father introduced David Ricardo into, working as a stockbroker. But at the age of 21, he met his wife, who was not Jewish, but a Quaker, and married her soon afterwards, which meant that he had to break with his family, and his father disowned him. And David Ricardo, did not benefit from the wealth of his father or his family anymore. But he had learned well how to work as a stockbroker and started his own business and became wealthy on his own again. So it is said that most of his fortune he made speculating on the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, which was the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and afterwards he retired. In 1818, he became a member of parliament, and at that time you became a member of parliament buying the seat from somebody. So he bought the seat in parliament from a member of parliament who resigned. And already in 1823, he died from an infection of the middle ear at the age of 51. So that's briefly something on his life, and we continue with his lifetime. So in the background, of course, there was the ongoing Industrial Revolution starting in England and spreading over Europe, and as we heard in the very beginning, being somewhat late, but then very successful here in Bavaria. But when the book was published in 1817, that was before the large drops in costs of transport. So it was before the railroad and also before the spread of the steamship in transport. We already talked heard that during his lifetime, what was important were the Napoleonic Wars between France and Britain, and also spreading over the continent from 1792 until 1815. And those wars resulted in a disruption of trade in many ways. So France banned the import of many British goods. Britain blockaded the French coast. Later, Napoleon had the continental blockade, banning trade with England and he tried to have this blockade in all the countries that he controlled or could control. And we also had an embargo imposed by the US President Jefferson, because the US were neutral in those wars, but they suffered because their ships were seized by the British Navy. And Jefferson tried to bring Britain to an end of this practice with a ban of overseas shipping. But it turned out that the US suffered more than the UK, so he stopped that again. So after the war, groups who had benefited from the disruption of trade lobbied for protectionism, and they obtained it. In England, the landlords had benefited from the disruption of trade, and corn prices were high, and they got protection, the corn laws that were introduced in 1815. And something similar had taken place in France as the textile industry was built up during the wars, and probably benefited from the absence of British competition during the war when trade was disrupted, and also the French textile industry got the protection it demanded. So this draws attention to the distributional effects of international trade that are still important today, because neglecting the distributional effects, of course, we cannot understand why there's resistance to international trade. If we trade economists keep emphasizing that trade is beneficial to all countries participating in international trade, we would not have an explanation for the resistance to international trade and the demand for protectionism, but it's the distributional effects that explain this resistance. And, well, Ricardo, of course, had his own interests in that, because he was a capital owner, and it was in his interest, his personal interest also, that the corn laws would be abolished. Okay, we come to another point in history, recalling again Ricardo's example, the trade between England and Portugal, and the two goods involved in that example, namely wine and cloth. So these indeed were important, or the main goods that were traded between Portugal and England, and had a long tradition due to the Methuen Trade Treaty that was agreed on between England and Portugal in 1703. The context was the independence of Portugal from Spain, and that Portugal wanted to stabilize its situation. So the treaty was a military and commercial treaty between England and Portugal, and the commercial part, that was an early preferential trade agreement, stating preferential treatment for Portugal's exports of wine and port to England, stating in particular that the tariff would be lower than the tariff for French wine, and for England's textile exports to Portugal. The preferential treatment of Portugal's wine exports to England resulted in trade diversion, because with equal treatment, England would import the wine from France, and now importing the Portuguese wine was not importing it from the country where it was cheapest. And that was already understood in that time. There was some intuition of trade diversion, that a preferential trade agreement would not only create trade, but could be harmful also for the participating countries. And Adam Smith, for instance, was against this treaty. He didn't like it. This was kind of forgotten in the course of time, because when Weiner in 1930 came up with this idea again, that a preferential trade agreement or a customs union might not only be harmful for third countries, but for the participating countries themselves if the trade diverting effects dominate the trade creating effects. This was kind of surprising, and Gottfried Haberler, who also was mentioned already in his book, denied that and said, well, this would not be possible, that reducing tariffs would harm the participating countries. Well, on England's preferential treatment for the textile exports to Portugal, it is discussed whether they were harmful for Portugal because it prevented Portugal from building up a known cloth industry. This drives attention to the idea of infant industry protection, that the argument is that industry can only be built up behind tariff barriers. Well, this, of course, is highly discussed, and also, well, trade economists don't really believe in that nowadays anymore, but that's the idea of this discussion. And the statement is that comparative advantage is a static concept, and that it neglects dynamics, as, for instance, building up new industries. Okay, the last point is I looked up what was the situation in Germany at that time and the situation on trade. So after the Napoleon, Germany was splintered into 38 sovereign states, well, having many, many borders within Germany. A large state was Prussia. But there was not only those borders impeding trade, but on the continent, it was typical that tariffs were not collected at the external borders of a state, but at points like town gates, bridges, road crossings, and so on. So there was also impediments to trade within those states. An exception to this was England. England did not have those interior tariffs, but on the continent that was typical. And so in 1818, 1 year after the publishing of Ricardos' books, Prussia introduced a new border tariff system, abolishing all those internal tariffs and introducing tariffs at the external border. So in 1818, the new tariff system of Prussia introduced free trade within Prussia. Well, Prussia was not the first German state having such a reform. The first one was Bavaria in 1807, Württemberg and Baden, but the Prussian tariff system essentially became the tariff of the Zollverein that was founded in 1834, but actually that was a long history because it had predecessors, and it grew after its founding in 1834. Do I have 2 minutes left, or should I stop? Okay, just 3 remarks on the Zollverein. So it was a customs union of German sovereign states, becoming larger and larger, so gaining members. The customs union, or the Zollverein, was the blueprint for the European Economic Community, the European Union, and the Treaties of Rome in 1957 because it was the only example in history where economic integration preceded political union. For us, it's kind of normal thing that we think of economic integration fostering political integration. But at that time, for instance, the United States, when it was the United States already, they still had customs borders within its territory. Switzerland also had customs borders. Austria-Hungary was not a uniform customs area. And so the notion at that time was that political union would be first and economic integration the next step. And within the Zollverein, there were different views on external tariffs, a disagreement whether external tariffs should be low or high. So some countries were in favor of low tariffs and free trade. That was Prussia. In general, you can say northern states, and in the south, Baden also advocated low tariffs. And some states were in favor of the infant industry argument, for instance, Bavaria and Württemberg. And Austria even had a prohibitive tariff system, so they had very high external tariffs, also one reason why they could not become a member of the Zollverein. Okay, so these were some remarks on Ricardo and some historical background of that time. Thank you.
Okay, let me thank all the speakers for these very illuminating ideas about the Ricardo's life, about the evolution of his theory of comparative advantage, and many fine lines that we learned. I think Ricardo's theory is really path-breaking, and it's really exciting. And let me just end with the two sentences. The organizers will give me so much time. When I carry Ricardo's theory to the classroom, of course, we start with England and Portugal, but I immediately switch from England and Portugal to the United States and China, and from wine and cloth to high-tech and low-tech goods. And when you do this, and when you see his theories from this light, it's really exciting. It's path-breaking, and it's current. It's wonderful. Let's give our speakers a big hand to end this session, and then we move on to Ricardo today.